Welcome back, dear colleagues. I hope that you had an enjoyable coffee break. We're back for the second session of the morning, and we're now getting into the integration dimension of our work. And this session in particular will be devoted to biodiversity and energy, which is a very topical subject, in particular because the Latvian Presidency made this a priority for the Informal Council a month ago. We've got 3 speakers for this session, and we will proceed in the same way as we did for the first session. They will all present, and we will then hopefully have some time for questions and reactions from the audience. We will start without any further ado with the first speaker, Jurijs Spiridonovs, Deputy State Secretary at the Ministry of Economy. I'm sorry for probably mispronouncing your name, but I did my best. You will take us to the linkage to the Informal Council, which was co-hosted by the 2 ministries on the presidency side, and of course attended very often by both sides from the member states and commission's perspective. So we look forward to your introduction. You've got a lot of experience in the environment and energy fields, and I hear that you also worked for the Ministry of the Environment before working for the Ministry of the Economy, so you're the perfect person to make that presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to start a day when somebody is calling you a perfect person, so I'm really pleased to be here, and it's wonderful that I can talk a bit about environmental issues once again, which I haven't done quite a lot in recent years. We have a technical problem. As you may see, the panel is composed only of men, which is a bad thing for biodiversity as well. And I would suggest that we have, because it's not a very formal meeting, it's a bit an informal meeting. Aldo, would you mind joining us on the panel? So to make it a balanced approach, and I guess that's how it works. You have to act, not just talk, and that's what I actually proposed to the ministers during the Environmental and Energy Council. Start, yes, there is even a chair, so everyone has its possibility to be a part of the process and actually act. I will start by something not very, very understandable. So that's a fire in Africa, and let's presume that's state of Chad. Why that particular country? It has a very interesting story. Currently, only 10% of population in Chad are connected to electricity grid. So 90% of the people can't actually have electricity at their homes, which influences a lot their daily life, studies of the children, cooking, everything we think is very easy to understand and which is very typical for us in our everyday life, but not for people in Chad. However, they have fires almost every year when the grass or everything else burns, and it creates the energy. And the amount of energy created in Chad by fires is equals to the necessary energy amount for annual consumption if all of the people in the country would be connected to the grid and would receive electricity. That's just an example how we actually don't use our resources, and the nature actually shows the way, what is the possibility and what is the possible solution for each particular country, how we can use the resources we actually possess to serve the needs of our citizens and serve the needs of the people. Why energy policy and why such a strange combination? For the very first time during all the European Councils, ministers of environment and ministers of energy sit together and discussed issues on biodiversity. So it was great fun for me because I know both sectors, but it was really great fun for me and for my minister to see how the ministers of energy discussed biodiversity and vice versa, how the ministers for environment tried to discuss energy. So it was a great fun for us, but on the substance, it was also very essential. And going back to the problem we actually had and we have now, these are the prices for energy. And when we look across the European Union, the price difference is very huge. But when we analyze it even deeper, for example, we take into account renewable energy share in the annual consumption of energy of different member states, we also see that this picture is also very different from state to state. Why so? Because we all have different paths for development, we all have different problems to solve. But definitely, one of the major issues we have on the table is how to create better possibilities to explore the options we have in Europe in using renewable energy sources. And so we are very similar to Chad in that respect. We are very similar to all the other countries in the world. Just to give you brief information on energy and why we are so concerned about the energy sector right now, is that actually European Union is a great purchasing power for energy resources because it actually needs a lot of energy but can't produce in such amount. And so more than 50% of the energy is actually imported in energy. That creates some problems with different aspects of our everyday life, like security concerns, like problems on external suppliers. Let me remind you one wonderful work by Mr. Tennessee Williams, great American playwright, A Streetcar Named Desire. So that's a very bad story. So it ends in a very devastating way, but almost the last words of Blanche Dubois, the main character of the book, of the play, she says, I always was dependent on the kindness of strangers. So Europe now depends on the kindness of strangers. Maybe not so strangers, but definitely on kindness, because we don't produce the necessary amount of resources in the European Union, and we need to bring them to the European Union, and we have to use the contacts with the parties which sometimes are not very politically, right to communicate in a particular moment. That's the energy problem, and that's how the energy ministers somehow found the linkage between them and biodiversity, because renewable energy sources, as you know, much better than the energy ministers, are very much linked to the questions of biodiversity. Some other aspects of the same story, we spent a huge amount of money on subsidizing fossil fuels, and we do it still in Europe in many countries, including this one. We do pay a lot of subsidies also for renewable energy, but that's not comparable to what we actually pay to fossil fuels and other subsidized production of energy. So energy is almost everything, and energy influences our life a lot, but energy in complement with renewable energy sources does produce a field for us to come together and discuss joint problems. Just some months ago, on 6th February 2015, just here, actually particularly this place, Vice President for European Union, for Energy Union, Mr. Maroš Šefčovič, presented some initial ideas on Energy Union. And actually it was a very great event for Latvian Presidency and for all of us to start the debate. And just to remind you, Energy Union is something which comprises of 5 dimensions. Dimensions which are not isolated, dimensions which are linked together. And just to name some of them, I would probably say that for this discussion, for this conference, 2 are quite important. And one is very important, that's a question of decarbonizing the economy. reduction of CO2 emissions. And that's definitely, it can't be not linked with the discussion of renewable energy sources. That's not isolated from the talks on Paris COP. And all these stories come together and coming together during our presidency, which we are very proud of. And that was a very good background for the ministers to start the discussion. During the October European Council, the heads of the government agreed on some particular efforts regarding the climate changes in the forthcoming years till 2030, which includes some specific focus on renewable energy sources, 27% across the EU. It's not binding for each particular member state, but it's binding for the EU. So, in that respect, this discussion we had was very much linked to the question of Paris and to the questions which are coming also after our presidency and which will be relevant for Europe till 2030. One other dimension I would like to specifically mention, it's not an energy efficiency, which is very important, but I would rather talk about research, innovation, and competitiveness. This particular aspect very much links us together because we have to work hard on making the technologies accessible and also efficient, not only for money making, but also for the sake of environment, for the sake of reduction of footprint or influencing the not very healthy or not very efficient use of renewable energy sources. And this particular dimension is very important when it comes to energy union. So when we talk about the technologies in energy sectors, we don't think about just the best technologies for economical use or financial use. We talk about the technologies which bring environment and energy together. Another dimension which is not covered by energy union, but which stands quite close to that, is a dimension of joint diplomacy. And when we talk about joint diplomacy, this year we talk about Paris COP. And this definitely will be a very good lesson, bad or good, for Europe when it comes to some results of Paris COP. The proposed actions of the Commission include that we have to work more close together when it comes to the joint problems or joint big issues like the climate policy across the globe. And I guess that's not a secret that now we talk about road to Paris, but we used to have many different roads before. Road to Copenhagen, road to Doha, road to Durban, and all these roads do not always have a good ending. So we have to be cautious that that's just not one road we have to take and one road we have to complete. We have to talk about the policy which should be sustainable and should be linked to our diplomatic efforts all over the globe when it comes to European interests and when it comes to promotion of European values. During Riga Informal Council, which is really first try to bring together the members of some different communities, and I can say it in a very easy way because I survived both communities, both environmental and energy. I would say that environmental people are the best people in the world. You are so nice, you are so open, you are so interesting to talk about, but you don't understand anything about the money. And on the other hand, energy people are very smart, sharp, financial people, which don't care much about the friendships or open mind, but talk about money and projects. So I have both parts in me, and today I am trying to combine them, which is, somehow difficult, but still. Riga Council, which was held just for the sake of trying to bring these communities together on one field to play or on one field to trying to communicate, was a great success in our opinion, because it actually showed up that some energy ministers are quite capable to talk about environment, and some environmental ministers are quite capable to talk about the energy, which is a very good sign for Europe, because for the energy union, we have to take into account both parts, because it's not possible to survive with just one. When it comes to the particular interest of energy ministers, I have to show you one graph, the average prices of resources around the globe. And one is clear, the European Union, even in 2035, will have prices for electricity and natural gas twice higher than the United States. And what's the answer? What's the answer for that? Because we will be still not very competitive against the other major economies. And the answer probably is use better the resources you possess, remember charge and act, and do something in order to make your resources used to maximum capacity. But here comes the environment, and we have to be very cautious, and that was the essence of the discussion. I will show you some outcomes of our preliminary report, which is due to be completed this week, as I was just informed. Yes, Aldan, we're talking about you. And one particular story in that regards was very much linked to the planning process. Because during the planning, it's very wise to have all the possible already existing legislative acts in place, but still, even if the legislative acts do not, are not very clear regarding some particular actions and some particular things, it's not, it's not impossible not to use your own experience, your own intelligence, to have this proper discussion on environment during the planning process, also about in energy infrastructure. Another story was about energy markets and interconnections. It was observed by almost all the member states that if you want to use the energy resources we possess, renewable energy sources, we have to be very much linked together in order to have a possibility to transfer energy from one state to another. And it comes not as a surprise that this discussion happens in Latvia, since we are so-called energy island, so we are not very much connected in, for example, in the field of gas to other states, and we used to not be connected to other member states when it comes to electricity. And all these interconnections and building the internal market are definitely the keystone for building the energy union, because if we don't have that, all the discussion is not valuable. And internal market interconnections are very much linked to the question of financial resources, because if we don't have a market to sell our good, we have a problem with attracting financing for creating the technologies and also establishing good environmentally friendly projects. One very striking example is example on public acceptance. Our policy should have been accepted by the public, by the citizens, by the consumers. And then when it comes to the serious discussion on where to build energy infrastructure, what would be the price of energy produced by renewable energy sources, this public acceptance is crucial. Because when it comes to the sectoral policies, if your sector is not well perceived by public, then all our efforts in bringing Europe to independence in terms of energy, bringing our environment to a particular state, are worthless, because we don't have this public acceptance. And you know that your work is very hard sometimes to persuade people and the public to accept the environmental actions you take. And some other things which also mentioned during the informal council, it was a question about the financial incentives, which I a bit covered before, but exploring this topic. When it comes to the question of money, this world is not so poor as it seems. We have a lot of money, but when we have an investor, it has to have absolute clarity on a long-term policy for a member state for the long period of time. So it doesn't help when I say, go and invest, because now it's the time. I also have to show my policy for next 20 years when it's clearly written that I will not change my policy in 2 or 3 or 5 years, because if I don't do that, if I don't write a policy document like that, I will not have any investor in renewable energy sources in the field of renewable energy. And other aspect is we don't have to overpay, because we sometimes do that. I guess almost every one of us sometimes does some strange things when it comes to money, but when it comes to the competence of state, it seems that we have a very negative practice of over-subsidizing the renewable energy, which was a very bad thing, not for the state, but for the industry, because the public acceptance is diminishing, which is very worrying fact. And that's why we say, when it comes to the question of how much money we would like to pay for renewable energy producers, it should be wise to remember that it's better to have a less money, but for a longer period of time, than to have a huge amount of money and to block the entrance of new projects for many years. And to complete this, what was the discussion about? The discussion actually was about very known thing, and the thing you see now during the presentation is called energy trilemma. We have to ensure in our energy policy such a state where all the pillars or dimensions of the energy policy are balanced. Energy is sustainable, environmentally friendly, with low carbon emissions. Energy is affordable, so people can actually buy the energy we produce. And there is security over there that allows us to get the energy when we need it. When all three things come together, that makes a universe balance, which is enforced for all the member states of EU, but also for Chad and for all other countries. So we have to be cautious that despite the fact we are talking for the very first time in such a company of environmental and energy ministers, we still talk about energy trilemma, which is on the table for many years. But it was a very good discussion, and I really was proud to be a part of it. And thank you very much for environmental colleagues, which invested a lot into very good discussion during Informal Council. So thank you very much. I'm stopping here.
Thank you very much, Jurijs, for this very good presentation, this very nice outline of what was done through the Informal Council, but also more broadly for the outlook that you've provided on the interface between energy and biodiversity issues, including in terms of cultures of work and ways of acting from one or the other side, which I think are not totally disconnected from the way in which we can achieve success. I actually think that you're right in pointing those out as being instrumental in knowing how to approach the other side. We'll now take the second presentation, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Rademacher from HeidelbergCement. Michael is Director for Biodiversity and Natural Resources, but also Program Director for BirdLife Cooperation Global at HeidelbergCement, and HeidelbergCement is one of our members of the Business and Biodiversity Platform, so we're very happy to have you here today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Francois. Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here today, somebody from the industry. And I would like to talk about the integration of biodiversity and the sustainability strategy of a company. The company is HeidelbergCement. HeidelbergCement is a German company that you maybe get a little bit an impression what is HeidelbergCement. I would like to give you a short overview. HeidelbergCement is the number 1 in aggregates in the world. We are the number 2 in the ready-mix concrete production and the number 3 in cement. There are some other competitors which are bigger than HeidelbergCement, and we have more than 45,000 employees worldwide, more than 2,000 locations all over the world. We are in more than 40 countries working, and you see already the EU with 28 countries is already very complicated if we talk about the implementation, and you can imagine that a company with 40 countries might be much more complicated to implement biodiversity issues. Biodiversity and management on the promotion of biodiversity is one part of the sustainability strategy of our company. HeidelbergCement signed in 2008 the Leadership Declaration for Biodiversity. Since that time, we established in our company a department globally, worldwide, responsible for sustainability. There is biodiversity, a vital part of that development, but also resource efficiency, climate protection, sustainable construction, and environmental impact reduction. So energy, of course, is also part of that department, but please allow me to talk a little bit more about biodiversity. I'm by myself ecologist, I'm botanist and zoologist, working since 14 years in that company. And dear Jurijs, I would like to show you that also ecologists working in industry should have knowledge about economy, because working for a German company that implements that, you have to know also what happens on the economical level if you talk about the implementation of biodiversity. So I would like to show you, but first of all, allow me to give you some information about biodiversity in mining sites. Most of the people think mining areas are dead areas, are not good for biodiversity. I would like to show you that if you rehabilitate, if you manage biodiversity in a right way, mining sites could be really paradises for biodiversity, and I'm not only as ecologist convinced about that, I would like to show you some facts. The 4 reasons why biodiversity can be a very good alternative in mining sites is that there are a variety of different habitat conditions. The habitats are mostly poor in nutrients, and we have a highly dynamic landscape due to the mining activity. So the mining activities overtake a dynamic which is not longer existing in our cultural landscape, because no floodings are allowed and landslides and so on are stopped. So where has nature dynamic? And that's in mining sites. And we have marginal disturbances. That might sound strange for you, because the big disturbance is we dig a big hole, and after that hole everything is destroyed. That's true, but these are the only places where natural succession can start. And for our activities, and of course we are always, before we start with mining activities, there is an environmental impact assessment, and the whole mining process will be assessed also from biodiversity point of view. But very important for a really strategy for biodiversity promotion in mining sites is that these activities start during the mining activities. So during the mining activities, we have a vital community of flora and fauna, which in our mining sites, which really likes this very dynamic situation. We call that pioneer species, and I will later on give you some examples. But then the other part, beside the active mining sites, of course, is the rehabilitation of old mining sites. There, of course, biodiversity can play a very important role by really creating the right habitats and allowing species communities to live inside. This is always a discussion with the communities in the surrounding. We, not as companies, decide what will happen with mining sites. It is the community who decides at the end what will be the outcome of an old mining site. That biodiversity promotion is not only like to have for mining industry, is already defined in 2006 by the Council on Mining and Metals. And I would like to give you some overview about the reasons why biodiversity is important. It's first of all, it ensures us the access to land, so raw material reserves, we need that. Building materials like concrete, like cement are only available if we dig holes in the world, otherwise we are lack out of these materials. So if we don't save our natural resources for a long time, we will lose the basis for our business model. We raise with biodiversity management the reputation. So we influence positive the perception of communities, which is very important. Our business is not really well seen very often in the discussions. Also, which is more and more important for our company as a global player is the open access to capital linked to the Equator principles. For example, we have recently projects in Kazakhstan or in Africa and Togo where environmental impact assessments on European standards are demanded by the banks which gave us the money. We have an increase of investor confidence and loyalty. We are a shareholder company. Our investors want to see that they invest money in a company which is sustainably working, and that more and more we see that every year on the shareholder assemblies in Germany. There are questions coming regarding sustainability, energy, CO2 reduction, but also biodiversity. And we learned over the last 14 years that as more as we take this topic really serious, we have shorter and less contentious permitting cycles. That means the costs for the very long permitting processes are reduced because we save time and we save some money for special consultations. I will show you later some examples. And of course, which is very important, our operations, the big cement plants, the aggregate sites, they can use biodiversity projects to find new ways of an improvement of the communication with the communities in the surrounding of the mining sites. So these are, of course, even if it's sometimes difficult to define the financial figures, these are clearly business cases, why it makes sense that our industry take care on that. We are not alone. All our competitors are on the same way. We are working at that point close together. And through business and biodiversity initiatives, for example, in Germany, but also the business and biodiversity platform on EU level, we see that more and more companies are looking for in their business, what is the business case? Why is it important to take care on biodiversity? And I think the mining industry is for that a very good example and very easy to understand where are the links to biodiversity. So we developed over the last years a clear policy in our company regarding biodiversity. We implemented principles and targets. We have a team of in-house ecologists. I was 14 years ago the only ecologist. Nowadays we have 14 in-house ecologists already, and it's an increasing number of ecologists. We developed global key performance indicators and, on top for the operations, monitoring indicators, which indicates on site level the biodiversity value of the mining site in comparison to the surrounding areas. We were the first company in our sector to publish an internal guideline for biodiversity management in quarries and pits. And when I mean internal, that means you can find all these documents on our homepage, so they are not confidential. We publish these things, and we are happy if other competitors are using our manual. I talk about a handbook, about 80 pages, where we describe really what we want to see in our mining sites. We have trainings for our employees, and a very vital part of our biodiversity strategy implementation is the cooperation with non-governmental organizations. First of all is the BirdLife partnership. So we have a big partnership with BirdLife International, but on local level, of course, we work with many other NGOs together, for example, in Africa with the Jane Goodall Institute. And last not least, we are also open for development projects, which we had developed in the past together with the GIZ. Our main principles are, I don't want to go too much in details, but for us very important that biodiversity protection is clearly linked to the soil protection. So we destroy soils, you know, if you dig a big hole, you have to chip away, you have to take away this topsoil. The question is, what are you doing with this topsoil? In the past, of course, nobody has taken care on that. We nowadays have a clear training and a management of our topsoils. We take care on them, we develop them, we use them once again. So it's really something which is in the center of our biodiversity strategy. But it's also the water, groundwater, surface water, that's very important, and it's linked to the biodiversity strategy. Also important is the question of invasive species. It was already discussed this morning. Of course, mining sites are open spaces. Natural succession starts from zero, so invasive species have very good starting points. That's a big topic for us, and we try to regulate that. For example, it's obvious and it's absolutely mandatory for our sites that they use local plants for the rehabilitation, not longer any invasive species as it was in the past. Our key performance indicator, I showed you that. I would like to give you a little bit more in view about that. First of all, of course, it's important that all our mining sites will have and have in the future rehabilitation plans which take into account the topic of biodiversity protection. But also, we, together with BirdLife International, we evaluated our mining sites about the fact if they are in areas with high biodiversity value, and for these sites which are in areas with high biodiversity value, we develop special biodiversity management plans. This is the until now published results, so we have the ambitions 2020. The targets were 50% for aggregates and for the cement sector. We will change from 2016 our ambitions. We will now have from next year 100% in that, because we showed already that until 2014 we achieved 80%. So we see now clear the chance to reach 100%. So 100% of our mining sites in biodiversity, high biodiversity areas will have biodiversity management plans in the future. I talked also about these indicators. It's one thing to have key performance indicators, which helps me as ecologist a lot to transport the topic of biodiversity into the management system of the company, the environmental management system of the company. It supports that all countries in the world have to think about the integration of biodiversity into the environmental management system, because they have to report figures to the managing board, so that's a little bit force them a little bit to really work on it. But these indicators are very weak when it comes up to the operations. So there, of course, we need other indicators, and we developed for our company, together with the German government, together with universities, a set of 10 indicators which evaluates the value of the mining site in comparison to the surrounding habitats and flora and fauna. This is well done, and many companies are preparing wonderful papers and are creating wonderful books about these things, as long as you can't convince the employees in your company, in the operations, the lorry driver, the loader driver, that they really have to follow the things. It's a useless, teethless tiger. So very important for our strategy is that we have an internal and external training. And since many years now, we train internally by seminars our employees. We produce homepages in different languages for our employees on intranet and internet. Another very simple example is that we produce posters for our quarry managers. So in the quarries, in the social rooms where the workers eat, there are posters about biodiversity, and these posters are really for the location. That means really the species which exist in the location are described there, and the potential of protection is also described there. I would like to give you 3 examples how mining sites can, of course, cooperate also with a very discussable system or discussed system with Natura 2000. I have clearly to state on that point, I will come up to that later on once again, that for us the Natura 2000 legislation as it exists is okay. We think we don't need any refit system, because we learned to live with that system. We see clearly that we can even contribute in some parts to the system. And so I'm very happy that HeidelbergCement, together with the CEM Bureau, has clearly mentioned this position also to the European Union. And that is one example which I would like to give you in Germany, where our mining sites are part of the protection system of the yellow-bellied tot. You see this animal on the right-hand side. So now we are talking a little bit about species, and where we are integrated with all our mining sites in Germany in this protection system of the National Strategy for Biodiversity. We create ponds, we monitor the populations, we work close together with the German NABU, which is a vital partner for us. And so we really try from year to year to increase the populations. And after some years of depression now, we see clearly that these yellow-bellied tot populations are increasing, and they are stepping stones, our mining sites now, for other populations in the surrounding. Another example is the St. Martin. St. Martins are in most of the European countries linked to mining sites. Germany, in 100% of the population, exists only in mining sites, and we have a big issue if we have to work during the breeding season. What happens with that walls? So we initiated some years ago a St. Martin management program. 80 sites are integrated in several European countries. And at the end now we have a breeding population of more than 11,000 St. Martins, which we monitor, which we give consultation to the operations, how to support these populations by, at the same time, of course, keep also the production running. That means in springtime, some walls will be destroyed, but at the same time, we create new breeding walls for the birds. So if they arrive from Africa, they find a new breeding places. A win-win situation. We can do our business, and the birds can breed. A last example, which is getting more and more important, is the education. More and more people ask to learn more about mining sites because they know now there are many endangered species inside. It's very nice places. So we install more and more in all our countries in Europe nature trails. We engage guides. Once again, we work close together with NGOs. And these nature trails get sometimes really unbelievable high acceptance by the population. This is once again an example from Germany. We inaugurated this year 2 nature sites in Belgium also. In Germany, this is around Heidelberg, and Heidelberg integrated the mining sites in their tourist program. We have sometimes per year 5,000, 6,000 visitors of our nature trail. We talk about the production of building materials, of course. We talk about the company, but we talk also about rehabilitation, habitats which are created, species living inside, and of course also the history of the mining activities in Europe and that region. I would like to come a little bit to the position of HeidelbergCement in the political discussion. We clearly see that we have to take biodiversity as one of the centerpieces of our sustainable strategy because it's licensed to operate for us. If we don't take care of these things, if we don't get the acceptance of the communities, we will have in the future no chances to get new land for mining activities. So that is really the business case, the economical part, where we learned that we have to take it carefully. Very important is for us another point that we clearly stay with Natura 2000. We think that's a good regulation, but there is a tendency recently that the implementation on the countries is very diverse, let me tell you like that. So we have in many countries overloading implementations. There exists a handbook, I will give you one example, there exists a handbook which clearly says that a priori a mining in Natura 2000 sites is possible as long as you can prove, of course, that an environmental impact assessment shows that your mining is not destroying the protection targets of the Natura 2000 sites. Some countries in Europe misunderstand that and give clearly no-go areas, so they say clearly Natura 2000s are no-go areas for mining. That is, in our opinion, the wrong way because that will, from the beginning, create a lot of conflicts with the mining industry. I think these 3 examples I show you was already a first glance on that there are really an added value if mining industry and nature protection works together. We learned that it makes sense for a company to really get support from an external partner. We choose BirdLife International because they are, from organizatorical point of view, similar to our organization. We learned in the 3 last years that there's really an added value if mining companies and NGOs work together. It's not out of conflicts, it's not always sunshine, that's for sure. There are different opinions, but it's vital to discuss them together instead of really working always against each other. And we learned that it's a good job to work together, and for the first 3 years, you know, German company, very careful, so I got the budget only for 3 years for this partnership. But now the managing board in this year prolonged the partnership once again for 3 years, and all managing board members agreed that we have to bring it beyond Europe. So we will now start in Africa and in Asia with new partnership projects because of the success of the first round. So partnerships with NGO is something which is really essential for a good implementation of biodiversity in the business. There is a big lack of scientific information about the ecology of mining sites, which species are living there, what is the succession, in which direction will it go. So that was for us a sign that we have to attract young students and student classes, but also really high school people to come in our mining sites and start research. So we created in 2012 the Quarry Life Award. That's a big award, and you see more than 20 countries, HeidelbergCement, where we are active countries, are contributing. We have more than 70 participating sites. More than 200 universities are nowadays participating in this award. And we have a third round. We had already 2 rounds, so they were very successful. We have in 2016 a third round, and we'll also a little bit promote this Quarry Life Award. So if you are knowing professors which are interested in this topic, please invite them. You see also the project categories. It's habitat and species research, so the classical biologist work. We have biodiversity management, that's more the practical implementation of biological knowledge. Education and raising awareness, it's all over the world, getting more important, so we have many universities working on that topic. And we have a new category in the third round, it's beyond quarry borders. We realize that our mining sites are not only stepping stones, they can be also links in between different habitat types in the landscape, and of course we would like to see how mining sites can, for example, be linked with urban areas, so with urban ecology, and we hope that we get a lot of projects researching regarding the network function of mining sites. And we have special projects for student classes, which means for kids. They are also, of course, very highly invited to work in our mining sites. It's a big success, and I would like to show you that that helps us to get more information about ecology in mining sites, but also we get a lot of ideas for the implementation of biodiversity-friendly rehabilitation methods. And we widely use that, we implement that, for example, in Africa, which are most active recently. We implement these things also in our future rehabilitation work. Knowledge exchange is very important, so if you are interested, all the dates, all the studies are published, nothing is confidential. You see on the www Quarry Life Award, you can find the information. Yeah, that is also already the end of my presentation. Many thanks that you listen. This is a view on a mining site in Maastricht in the Netherlands, where is biodiversity protection, historical monuments, and also tourist attraction combined by the city of Maastricht. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this presentation, which took us into the groundwork, and many thanks for the examples that you've provided us with. I think it's very useful to see how this is happening at the level of projects and sites, and you just did this, and I saw commonalities in the 2 presentations that we've heard in terms of perceptions of communities, public acceptance, dialogue, partnerships. So this is certainly something which we may come back to towards the end. Let me now introduce my dear colleague Stefan Leiner, head of the Nature Unit in the Environment Directorate General, as you know, in charge of nature, and therefore the Birds and Habitats Directive as well as Natura 2000. And Stefan will present to you the new guidance document on Natura 2000 and forests, a topic which I'm told to say is very important for Latvia, because Latvia is very forest rich, and those forests are very rich in biodiversity, and those forests are also, of course, important sources of energy, and activities that are taking place there are at the core of what we're discussing today on the energy and biodiversity interface. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francois, and it's really a topic that is also very much dear to my heart, because I'm a forester from education myself, and I always wondered why there is this conflict between forestry and nature conservation all around Europe. And this is really one of the reasons why we have said that we need a guidance document on this topic, because we have seen in the implementation of our nature legislation that forest and the forest sector was one of the key sectors where there are really a lot of problems in the implementation. Now, it's also a bit of a strange thing, because as much as we are proud that we managed to publish the State of Nature report in time for this conference, which was something that needed a lot of efforts and speeding up procedures as much as we could, and really all levers, playing with all levers, so we get that adopted in time. As far as this guidance document is concerned, it is not yet there. It is ready, it is finalized, but we still need to get it through the formal procedures within the Commission, and this is why I will present you something that is not there existing, but it will be there very soon. We hope before the summer break it will be available. Now, when we talk about Natura 2000 and forests, we really talk about a common business. These are things that are very much interrelated. Just two numbers: a fifth of the terrestrial area of the forests in the EU are covered by Natura 2000. And when you look at the terrestrial area of the Natura 2000 sites themselves, they are covered with over half of them by forest or other wooded land. So forests and Natura 2000 are really very much interrelated. Now, obviously, this situation is very different from one member state to the other. You have some when there is very little amount of their Natura 2000 area covered by forests, but you also have some member states, like, for example, Bulgaria or Cyprus, where you have over half of their forest is covered by Natura 2000. So that is clearly a very important relation there. But then it's also a big challenge, because when we look at, we zoom a little bit more into details of the State of Nature report Ronan Uhel has told you about, we see that also in the forest area, we are still far from having achieved the objectives of the directives. For example, the favorable conservation status of forest habitat types that are listed in the annexes of the Habitats Directive. Only 15% of the assessments have a favorable conservation status, which means that also in the forestry, in the forest management, we need to do a lot if we want to achieve with our European forests the objectives of the Habitats Directive. You can also see that there are some differences between the various regions, and the challenge is even higher in the area we are here, boreal and also Atlantic, than it is than other parts of Europe. So, as I said, because we knew that there were all these different perceptions, we said the best thing is what we do when we develop our other guidance document, like, for example, the guidance document on non-energy extractive industry and Natura 2000, what Rademacher has already mentioned, which is something that we do not develop ourselves, sitting in our office in Brussels, but we developed them in cooperation with those who are concerned about the issue. In this case, it is, of course, representatives of the forest industry, of the private and public forest owners, of the environmental NGOs, of the member states, the various administrations, both environment and forest agriculture administrations. And we were helped by a contractor, and that was really a joint exercise between DG Environment and DG Agriculture. We had workshops, we had a special ad hoc working group that we created that met over 4 times, and this is really the result of a 4-year-long process, this guidance document. And as often, the process is as important as the result, because it really also helped at the European level to discuss certain things and to enhance the mutual perception and the understanding. As I said, there was a lot of false perceptions and myths. There were concerns by the forest owners. At nearly every meeting I went of forest owners in Europe, I heard slogans like Natura 2000 is really an expropriation of our property rights. And on the other side, in nature conservation areas, we hear that these foresters are the main problems in getting nature conservation done. And these were the sort of issues that we know are not true on the ground. There are examples for that indeed, but we also know that our nature legislation and Natura 2000 can help bringing these parts better together. So it was really, we wanted to put everything on the table to have a frank discussion and to really see if those myths are reality or not. So in fact, it really tries to explain what the legislation is about, what Natura 2000 is about. It tries to answer specific questions that always appear in the issue of forests and Natura 2000. It aims to promote the integration of Natura 2000 conservation objectives in forest management, and it encourages mutual information, understanding, and cooperation between all parties involved. So it's also important to say that it's a guidance document, and therefore it is not meant to be an explanation of the legislation itself. It really tries to be not prescriptive in its intent, but to provide a source of information of all those that have questions, that want more clarity about what is the relationship between forests, forestry, and our nature legislation in Natura 2000. So it really is there to be addressed to the different sides that are involved in this, as much as the forest, as the environmental and nature conservation administrations, private sectors, NGOs, etc., who should, we hope, benefit from this guidance document. So it is structured in four basically elements. The first one is a general overview of the legislation. Then there is, and this is quite specific, and a new way of doing a guidance document by having a chapter called Frequently Asked Questions. And then we have a number of case studies from the various member states of the European Union, and then an annex with glossaries, references, where we list, for example, the forest habitat types and explain them that are listed in the Habitats Directive. I will now go a little bit more into these elements. The first one is really about explaining the main elements of the legislation, providing those numbers that I have mentioned before, but a bit more details about them. It then explains in a synthesized way what is the implementation of the Birds and Habitats Directive about, how do you have to go about the site selection, the management of the sites, the conservation objectives and the conservation measures, so the species protection provisions, Article 6, all of these elements are explained more in detail, but always with a perspective how this is relevant to forest and forestry operations. It then also has a chapter where it puts the political context, both in the EU Biodiversity Strategy, as already outlined by Francois, but also the EU Forestry Strategy. As you know, there is no legally binding legislation, there is no common forest policy, but there are a number of EU policies that have a direct impact on forest and are closely related to forestry, such as, for example, the nature legislation and our biodiversity policy, and all of that has been kind of put together into a joined-up EU forestry strategy that has all the three pillars of sustainable forest management: environmental, social, and economic. It also explains what are the main financing tools at the European level available in order to make sure that Natura 2000 and forestry are also being supported and the right incentives are being given to the various forest owners and managers of forests. The second is about the frequently asked questions. I will come to that a little bit more in detail. And there are some key messages that come from those frequently asked questions and from the guidance document itself. The first is really about sustainable forest management and Natura 2000, that these are not incompatible concepts, that on the contrary, they can and they should be mutually supportive. So it is possible to have forestry operations in a Natura 2000 sites in principle, and it is possible to have a kind of forest management that takes Natura 2000 requirements into account. You have to do certain things about it, but it is very important that you can do that. And there are some questions in there. For example, if there is a species that is listed in the annexes of the Habitats Directive in my forest, does it mean I have to stop economic developments, etc.? And it explains then in the frequently asked questions section under which conditions there is no incompatibility between the two. As I already mentioned, a lot still has to be done in order to achieve the favorable conservation status. Therefore, it is important when there is a forest Natura 2000 site that there is real management happening and that certain issues are being taken into account. For example, that, and there are some questions about this, what are the operations for which I need to do an appropriate assessment according to Article 6.3. Do I always have to do it? Under which conditions do I have to do it? How should I go about doing this? All of these are elements that are important. There is also, for example, questions on what are the key management measures that are usually important in integrating forests and Natura 2000. And when you look at the various management plans that are around, they usually relate to similar issues, which are about having a species distribution that has the natural features, having also the age classes in a varied feature into the forest, that has a number of dead wood, that avoids certain management practices that are particularly problematic. But it also has the message that it all depends on the individual forest site. There are some sites, for example, that really have just been designated for one species, and therefore there the main issue is to avoid disturbance if it's a forest species during the breeding and reproductory period, for example. So a lot depends on that, but it's also clear that those who are managing those sites, the forest and the forest owners, they really play a major role in making Natura 2000 implementation happening on the ground. But often, and there are examples for that, synergies are not being used because you have this, first of all, look at our administrative structure. Very often in Europe, forest administrations are a completely different administration than nature conservation administrations, and there still has a lot to be done to really engage in a constructive dialogue that looks at those possible win-win solutions. How can I achieve my Natura 2000 objectives in a way that in the least possible impacts my economic objectives and social objectives, and vice versa? A key element there are the management plans, and there has been a lot of discussion about this issue in the working group, because on one hand, management plans are not a legal obligation for all types of forest ownerships, but they are an important tool, usually particularly for larger forest owners, in deciding what will I do in the next 10 years, which are the crops I want to plant, where do I want to make my forest operations, forest road building, all of these kind of issues are being addressed there. And then you have, of course, it's not an obligation, but again, it is the tool that is mainly used in the member states to determine what are the conservation objectives and the measures needed to achieve them in the Natura 2000 sites are management plans for Natura 2000. And it is, of course, often a preference to have two separate plans, but often you can avoid a lot of problems if you develop integrated management plans, that when you develop your forest management plan, you integrate from the outset the Natura 2000 dimension that helps the forest owner to demonstrate that building certain things are not detrimental to the achievement of the conservation objectives, because you already had integrated that in an overall plan that showed that these type of forestry operations will help and will not be detrimental to achieving those conservation objectives. As I've mentioned, a fundamental prerequisite for this is that everybody knows, why is this actually a Natura 2000 site? What do I want to achieve there? What are the conservation objectives? This has to be very clear. And this is also why there are several questions about how is the best practice in developing these conservation objectives. They should not be developed by some consultant in the back of an office and then just put on the table and told to the owners of the forest, these are the objectives you now have to meet because your area is a Forest Natura 2000 site. They have to be ideally developed in cooperation with the local actors, with the owners, with the managers, with the nature conservation of organizations, etc. And the process in developing those conservation objectives or the management plans for Natura 2000 have often and more in Europe been an instrument to bring the two sides better together and to enhance the mutual cooperation between the two. But it is really essential that everybody knows what are the objectives I want to meet, as much as possible in a clear, quantified manner, i.e. this habitat type should either be maintained or should be increased by so many hectares in the next 10 years. Or this population of this species for which the site was designated should, if possible, be enhanced through, for example, not making any cutting so many meters around a tree that is hosting a nest of a golden eagle, for example. All of these things should be as clear as possible so that the forest manager knows exactly what has to be done. And then you can also calculate, for example, what are the economic effects of this activity, and you can integrate this into the scheme that incentivizes the implementation of these issues. And that is also an issue that came up a lot in the discussions. That is also an issue that comes up a lot in the fitness check exercise that we are undertaking at the moment, is that the financing framework that is around in Europe is not appropriate and is not sufficient in order to really make implementation of Natura 2000 happening. There are a lot of opportunities also in EU funding instruments, in particular the second pillar of the Common Agricultural Policy, the Rural Development Regulation. But for example, Forest Natura 2000 payments and even forest and climate change, forest environment measures are very, very little implemented by the various member states, either because the administrative burden is seen as being too hard, or because it is not really addressing the right issues, or because simply priority is being given to agricultural issues and therefore forestry, because public money is limited, is not being taken into account into the development of these schemes. So this is really an important element where there are also questions on which funds can I use, and hopefully it can help then in making the forest support important. But it's not only public money, it's also payments for ecosystem services, it's other ways of recognition, and the whole principle is really that we are not seeing this as a kind of a compensation, but as an investment, because investing in Natura 2000 in forest is something that is not only positive for the forest owners themselves, for nature conservation, but really for society at large, as all the ecosystem services that are provided by well-managed Forest Natura 2000 sites range over clean water, clean air, recreation, etc. They were mentioned by Ronan Joel again earlier. So I will not go into detail, just that the different frequently asked questions, they really address all those particular issues, ranging from the site designation to conservation objectives to the conservation measures. What does it mean there cannot be deterioration? What are the forest management requirements on financing, on planning, on monitoring and evaluation, on communication cooperation, and on species and Forest Natura 2000 issues outside the Natura 2000 sites. So, for example, there is the question, how can I find out more about the Natura 2000 sites that have been designated, or who is responsible for setting the conservation objectives? Are the forest owners consulted or involved? Does the presence of a species of EU importance require necessarily a change of forest management? Is non-intervention, for example, a very difficult topic also in the discussions? Is it a possible conservation measures in Forest Natura 2000 sites? Are forests in Natura 2000 to be managed only for nature conservation? If you want the answers for these questions, I think I already answered several of them in what I said before, but you will then have to read the frequently asked questions and the guide more in details. When I want to build a forest road, what do I need to do in a forest site? What are projects and plans according to Article 6.3 in the forest context? All these are questions that are being answered in these frequently asked questions. Very briefly, just the examples. There are many examples from all the member states. We tried really to have one for each member state. For example, in Latvia, there is an example of measures outside Natura 2000, because it's not enough in order to achieve a favorable conservation status of forest-related species and habitats to only look within the sites. You also have to have a green infrastructure approach in your forest area more generally. And this is, for example, an example, ecoforest in Latvia, where outside Natura 2000 sites, there is the idea of really generating better recognition and better integration of nature conservation in forest management more in general. And then, as I mentioned, there are then several annexes. So as I said, the guide is finished and just waits to be published, and this will happen hopefully in the next, I will say, 2 months. We will then also translate it, not necessarily in all languages, but at least in the most common languages of the EU, because our translations budget has again been reduced even more, so we cannot promise that it will be translated in all languages. But this is very important, and this is the same message as was given from HeidelbergCement, and that is also something that comes out of the fitness check, is that our guidance documents, they are very much welcomed, but they are very little known and used at the local level. So local authorities, they don't know about it, they don't apply them, but this the Commission cannot do on its own. We really need you, the member states, the local authorities, but also the actors, the forest owners' representatives, both public and private, but also the environmental NGOs, the private sector, to really inform people that these guidance are due, maybe adapt them to your local conditions, make them in your own language in a slightly different way. But it is important that these are really being translated to the local level where implementation at the end is happening. We will continue the dialogue, so the working group will still meet once a year. And also, if at one stage we see that there are some very new hot topics, some new frequently asked questions that are coming, we are also ready to adapt the guidance document in the future. I thank you very much, and I'm now happy to answer any questions that you would have.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for what was a comprehensive preview of the guideline document, so I hope that this was appreciated by all. I think you've clearly given all the essence of what will be published later, so I hope that this can get us into an interesting set of Q&A sessions now. We have more than 10 minutes, which is luxury, so I'd like to know whether any of you have clarifications first, perhaps, anything you would like to see clarified from the presentations that were given. No, if not the case, then let's open for questions. Do you have questions or comments on the presentations which you would like to share with all? Yes, Alda.
Yeah, since I was invited to the panel for the sake of preservation of biodiversity, I understand. I thought, yeah, I should do a bit more than just sitting here, and then maybe to reflect on what was discussed in this session. After I had moderated the morning part of discussion, the dynamics in this panel was so much different than the previous one, because we could hear about so many good examples or ways how generation of energy production and then forest management and mining sector can coexist, or in fact even promote biodiversity, perhaps. But it also appears that it very much, the success of that depends on one important ingredient, and that is willingness to do that, the goodwill. And unfortunately, it is not always there. Well, from the first session, we learned that the picture is rather grim. I mean, if we look at the long-term picture, specifically about reaching biodiversity targets, and the pace of these actions is also probably a bit too slow. I mean, not to mention that there are also sometimes, unfortunately, some actors that on purpose want to circumvent some of the regulations. So I had also I would have a rather open question to provoke some more debate, and I hope the audience can also involve in that. But I would also want to hear the views from panelists. So how do we generate this willingness to act, and do we have to go for more regulatory measures at the EU level, perhaps, or the national? But how do we find the right balance between regulations and the willingness to act to get where we need to get? Yeah.
Thank you, Alda. Very valid question. So how do we generate confidence? How we can work in a mutually supportive way? Who would like to have a go at this from the panel? Yeah, Michal.
I have to start because when I hear the question if we need more regulations, I have to say from field ecology's point of view, but also from industry, no, we don't need more regulations. Please, not more regulations. We have already enough. But what we need is a really consistent implementation of the existing regulations. And what we clearly need is that all country administrations, Länder administrations, county administrations understand what means the European regulation, especially for Natura 2000 and things like that. There we have a tremendous challenges to do. When I see it in our permissions, it's sometimes unbelievable. There's no knowledge about what's ongoing in Europe when you have a mining project in Sweden or in Poland. Sometimes it's really difficult to find a way. So no more regulations, better implementation.
If I may, I think regulations are essential because otherwise not much happens. I mean, that is also true, I think, in our experience when we see how much has changed, just take the area of protected areas thanks to the implementation of the nature legislation, but also all the way that different sectors are now taking biodiversity seriously. Transport sector and others, this would not have happened without those directives. But on the other hand, they have to really be much better accompanied by a whole system of incentives that is, I think, as important as the rules themselves. And I already mentioned information, cooperation, discussing, bringing the people on board, but then also I think this morning the Common Agriculture Policy, and there will be a session on that, was mentioned. It's also the same in the forest sector, that sometimes you have the impression that those who do the best job for biodiversity, they have the biggest burden. They get maybe a little bit more incomes, but that is something that we hear a lot, that does not really compensate for the additions in administrative burden, in the risk of controls, of having to pay back something. So the whole system is really very much not, I think, conducive that we have at the moment to really get things implemented on the ground. And that's why these kind of issues also of awards, of recognition, they are very important in getting things implemented on the ground, because that's also an experience that most people like HeidelbergCement, they are very proud of having biodiversity in their area. Their aim is not to slash biodiversity. On the contrary, if they know what they have and that they, with just a few things, they can make a big impact for European biodiversity, then they will be very happy about that. And that's kind of positive messages that we need to put more in place, I think, in Europe.
Please.
I have to say that we have invited you not because you have to preserve something, because we just like you, and since it's live, you can just replay it and to have some good memories on this event. But to answer in a very serious way, in that I would say regulation doesn't produce best examples. Regulation does produce regular examples of implementation of regulation, but not the best. When it comes to innovation, regulation doesn't help. But one word which was very crucial, was crucial also for our presidency when we tried to define the goals and the targets, regional cooperation. We have very bad examples of not cooperating, also in energy sector. And that's why we promoted to have a new established formats for cooperation, exchange of information, and also including the renewable energy sources as part of it, like sharing information on subsidy mechanism, sharing information on all the other aspects, and that possibly bring people together and create some, long-term policy which is needed for involvement of the people, of the citizens, of the industries into certain processes, because it takes time. Let's not fool each other. It doesn't happen in 1 minute. We have to create some kind of trust, some kind of trust for us, for our knowledge, for our beliefs in certain policies to make it work. And regulation, as far as we are concerned, the energy sector, it doesn't work very much. Because yes, there is a lot of different regulation, and better implementation is what we always say when it comes to initiative of even more regulation.
Thank you. Let's perhaps open to the audience now. We've got a few more minutes. Who would like to react? Yes, I see at least 4. Well, what I suggest is that you make a big effort at being concise, and then we can take all 4. I would suggest that we take all 4 questions, and then we return to the panel. Starting with you, Thierry.
You are explaining that there is money available through the second pillar for forest in Natura 2000 area, but there is a real problem because many member states are not selectioning the measure, and there's a huge frustration in many countries because no private forester has any access to that. I can give you some examples, it would be too long, but I'd like to ask you what can you do in order to make sure that this money is not going only to administration, because this is a second problem. And then my second question is to the president of EEB. You are encouraging to use enforcement. And I do have a problem because I don't believe that enforcement is a good idea as a first solution when there is a problem. I do believe that you have to use sticks and carrots and try to first to educate. And when there is a recidive or a real problem, then go for enforcement. But enforcement should not be the rule at the first stage. So I will invite you I would like to have your answer on this.
Thank you, Thierry. We'll turn to the EB actually, because the EB wanted the floor. I think it was Peter rather than Jeremy. So Peter, your question or comment, please. It may already be providing part of the answer to Thierry's comment.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. The EB president, who's actually the EB Secretary General, just asked me to also include a reaction to Thierry in my intervention. And actually after lunch, we'll be both in a panel on the stage. So we might even continue the discussion afterwards, but I was going to pick up on this point about regulation, which may seem not like a big issue in case of the Natura 2000 network, where there is a certain consensus that we would rather go ahead with implementation, which of course includes enforcement. There is a bigger problem at this point in the way regulation is generally perceived as something not very useful, not very helpful. And I think if you look at the evidence, regulations have been key in driving a whole range of beneficial processes in the area of renewables. Without the Renewables Directive, which is a regulation, we wouldn't have seen the impact of the rise of renewables throughout Europe. In relation to innovation, regulation is what actually rewards the front runners. People who dare to innovate, who come out with new products, will be provided with markets and opportunities through regulations. That gives them certainty. I think another case in point there is the whole energy efficiency sector, which is just not getting off the ground because of a lack of binding targets, clear regulations, doesn't provide investment security. But I think the point about enforcement is a really fundamental one. I mean, if there is a law, it has to be enforced. I mean, you cannot have any other discussion about it. If someone's speeding, if someone violates the rules, enforcement is fundamental because that actually protects everyone else who is actually playing by the rules. Now, there is a debate about, there is a gray zone where rules are maybe unclear. You can provide guidance. If people have good intentions, you can encourage them to comply. But in the end of the day, people who don't have good intentions, do not want to comply with the with the law, need to comply with the law. I mean, that's a fundamental principle of society based on the rule of law.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you also for addressing Thierry's comment. We've already entered into the discussion, and there were two more requests in the back. We'll take the first one, the gentleman with the blue shirt, light blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Hubert Thoma from Nature Trust Malta. I would like to address a question to Mr. Rademacher. How has your policy vis-à-vis biodiversity affected your general situation with regard to your other competitors in the business? And how, if at all, have they reacted to your stand on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one last question. Yep.
Thank you. Andrew Jackson from Montashka in Ireland. I just have a quick comment and then a question for Stefan. If we look at the Irish experience in all of the sectors we've heard about, energy, extractives and forestry, I think there are two things are clear. First, there's been a huge learning experience since 79 with the Birds Directive, but in particular since 92 with the Habitats Directive. And industry and flanking industries like environmental consultants and so on have really developed capacity and learning in terms of appropriate assessment. And in that regard, I think we can see that there's a very clear benefit in settled regulation. You know, these industries now understand Natura 2000 and the nature directives and know how they work and how they are applied. And in that regard, I think it is very good to hear about new guidance, for example, in the area of forestry that Stefan talked about. And I think that that type of guidance will help and assist in terms of better implementing the directives as they stand. And so my question for Stefan was just, does the Commission have plans for other guidance on the nature directives in other sectors to help with better implementation in future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being very concise in putting your questions to the panel. I would then turn to the panel and ask our panelists to be equally concise in providing you with answers. Stefan.
Okay, thanks. First question from Thierry de Lescaille. I mean, I mentioned the same recognition of the facts, and that is due to several issues. One is that I think there is a competition between forest and agriculture, although often they are in the same ministry, and the agriculture administrations think, and it's the same with Natura 2000 more general, that this is our fund, this is our money, and it's not your money. And that is clearly happening. Therefore, we want to prioritize these instruments for real agricultural activities, because at the end it's the common agricultural policy, etc. So this is one thing that we hear. The other is that they have already a very good forest national scheme, so they use rather national budgets than EU instruments, because that relieves them from a number of administrative concerns. This is another one. But then I think it's also linked to the fact, as I said, that also within the forest sector itself, Natura 2000 is still seen something that is not in their own business, in their own interests, and therefore the lack of cooperation between environment administrations, that sector I mentioned, means that even where the money is there, it is not being promoted towards the forest owners. There are no real information being provided that what do you need to do in order to access this, how can I make your life easier. So all of that is linked with that. And then it linked, I think, also to the administrative burden itself and to some of the elements of the conditions. So the amounts are seen as not high enough. The fact that you cannot pay for more than 10 years. We speak in forests in very long issues. So what is considered as an investment compared to, etc. So I think there are still also within the regulations themselves, under the second pillar, some issues that are seen as a disincentive for getting things done. So the picture is very varied from one member state to the other, but the fact is indeed clear that a lot of opportunities are not being used. We help them by asking member states to develop what we call prioritized action frameworks, in which they say forestry is one of the key priorities and support for forest owners, and then we can use it in our dialogue with the member states in case they do not have any of those measures in the rural development plan. But at the end, the member states are the ones who decide for which measures they use EU money. On the questions on what other guidance we are planning, well, we are already working on some other ones, for example, on hydropower and Natura 2000, which is another key topic that is also linked to renewable energy. But then we want to wait for the results of the fitness check exercise and see what comes from that of issues where we see there are really biggest problems, and maybe that means that we need either to adapt existing guidance or to develop new guidance in new sectors, and therefore there is no decision at this stage that we will do new guidance. We are updating the overall Article 6 guidance that is also nearly finished, but for guidance to further come, we need to see what is coming up there from the fitness check.
Yeah, I would like to answer the question regarding the policy of HeidelbergCement and how our competitors react to that. So in the beginning, I have to say honestly that we got a lot of criticism, especially from smaller and medium-sized companies in the mining sector, because they thought that we raise up too high the level of that. And so until now, we have to convince also smaller companies and medium-sized companies that it's possible also for them to work on that topic, even if they don't hire biologists. It's always a question of cost at the end, of course. But from the beginning, all the other big companies, the big global players are working together. We work together since many years. We are in several task forces of the Cement Sustainability Initiative on global level and on national level, on many other business associations. We are working together. And we try also internally in our business organizations to convince smaller companies that there is an added value. I think a very important step is that mining association starts also to hire experts. It's always a lack of experts recently, which brings a lot of criticism. And there we see already that now is a tendency to hire ecologists in mining associations to give consultancy to smaller and medium-sized companies. So yeah, that's going in the right direction, I think. Thank you.
You know, I would just react on regulation issue once again, because I guess it's kind of important to understand that I fully agree with the idea on enforcement, because if you have a lot of different laws already in place, then probably the most important thing to do is just to try to follow the legal procedures already foreseen. But when it comes to establishment of new legislation, we have to be quite cautious, because sometimes we do create so many different regulations, but we actually can't track, and that creates even more problems and even more trust problems with the sector, each sector. So it can be problems if we do have so many regulations in different sectors. We'll have problems with the public acceptance of the sector itself. So definitely, I would suggest that we have to stick to cooperation formats, enforcement formats, but we have to really, and such an event and such a conference is a kind of helpful, helpful bits that create the overall picture, which actually is needed for policy to be successful.
Thank you very much. I think we've exhausted the time that we had. We've even deprived you of some of your lunchtime already, but I thought that it was useful to get questions through and the very informed answers you got from the panelists. So I would like to thank our panelists for their very interesting presentations and for the debate indeed, in giving them a round of applause. Thank you very much.